Just think of your favorite video game if you enjoy wasting unfortunate amounts of time gaming like I do. Fallout 4, New Vegas, Skyrim, or any of the Dark Souls. You know how you level up and get to choose where to invest points, and ultimately, basically you're trying to create a certain build. The crazy thing about life is you're doing the exact same thing, but with your body and your mind using epigenetic modifications. That's how you rewrite your story. Psychologically, yes. Equally importantly, yes. But even the stories encoded in your DNA.
As you take on a broader and broader range of challenges and you push yourself harder, then more and more of what you could be turns on, and that's equivalent to transforming yourself into the ancestral father. You get more and more informed because you're doing more and more difficult things, but more and more of you gets unlocked.
So what lifestyle changes do that?
What got you so interested in stories, John?
So I've always thought stories were narrative, right? There's something I thought about. I did not understand that my body was keeping the score, to quote Van der Kolk, right? That my body was revving up and fighting battles that I didn't even know was happening. And so we're looking at the long-term data, man, and people are having strokes and cancer and heart attacks from childhood experiences. And that made me step back and go, whoa, there's these different layers to these stories happening all over the place. And it's not just narrative, it's the entire ecosystem that I call my body, right? My human experience.
So the story stored in your body and mind will ultimately determine your fate. We understand, thanks to Carl Jung's diligent efforts and Jordan Peterson, Robert E. Johnson, Marie-Louise von Franz, Tony Wolff, and so many others, that the psyche is a vast ecosystem made up of various semi-autonomous partial personalities that we call archetypes. And in the same way that you have in your gut biome alone millions of microorganisms living together in this massive ecosystem where they compete for resources, form symbiotic relationships, fight, reproduce, and prey on one another like the diverse creatures in a South American jungle, for example. Your mind is also teeming with an even more complex and diverse and invisible cerebral, ideational, mental world of organisms. And to make matters even more mind-boggling, the consciousness of any one individual is connected to an infinitely larger ecosystem called the collective unconscious, or perhaps the collective consciousness, not too horribly unlike the solar system compared to the universe filled with countless solar systems. These mental superorganisms of your mind, these archetypes, all have their own narrative, their own story or collection of stories. A common story, for example, is the simple but ancient, primal, and powerful story of the snake. There are many stories of the snake, but one of the most straightforward and common stories about the snake is this two-word story: snake, danger. This simple story passed down from our ancestors is etched into some ancient stone-like tablet embedded deep in the unconscious, and there is evidence that it's even coded tangibly into our DNA. But why does this matter? Because these stories predict the future. They determine your fate. If you have this snake story in you, it's a part of you. You are destined, like most, to fear snakes. And you will inevitably pass this story on to your children, and they to their children, so on and so forth. But you can rewrite these stories. And to rewrite a story is to change its ending. That is, your destiny, so to speak. Let's talk about the practical methods to address the how side of things. The weird thing is, it is possible to rewrite or modify certain aspects of the genetic information encoded in your DNA. This process is generally known as genetic engineering or genetic modification, but we're not talking about that type of modification exactly. We're talking about epigenetic modifications, which are changes to your DNA caused by things like your diet, exercise, stress levels, exposure to toxins, and many other environmental conditions and lifestyle choices. That is, you can rewrite the stories encoded in your DNA, not the sequence itself. No, you're changing the way your genes are expressed or regulated. In other words, these epigenetic modifications turn genes on or turn them off, or they alter their activity levels. Here's Jordan Peterson explaining precisely that.
What you want to do when you identify something that someone is avoiding that they need to do because they're afraid, you have them voluntarily confront it. And so you break it down. What you try to do if you're a behavior therapist is you break down the thing they're avoiding into smaller and smaller pieces until you find a piece that's small enough so they'll do it. And it doesn't really matter as long as they start it. Then they can put the next piece on and the next piece. And what happens is they don't get less afraid exactly, they get braver. It's like there's more of them. And here's why. So imagine you do something new and that's informative, right? There's information in the action, and then you can incorporate that information and turn it into a skill and turn it into a transformation of your perceptions. So there's more to you because you've tried something new. So that's one thing. But the second thing is, and there's good biological evidence for this now, that if you put yourself in a new situation, then new genes code for new proteins and build new neural structures and new nervous system structures. Same thing happens to some degree when you work out, right? Because your muscles are responding to the load. But your nervous system does that too. So you imagine that there's a lot of potential you locked in your genetic code. And then if you put yourself in a new situation, then the stress, that's the situational stress that's produced by that particular situation, unlocks those genes and then builds new parts of you. And so that's very cool, because who knows how much there is locked inside of you. Okay.
Just think of your favorite video game if you enjoy wasting unfortunate amounts of time gaming like I do. Fallout 4, New Vegas, Skyrim, or any of the Dark Souls. You know how you level up and get to choose where to invest points, and ultimately, basically you're trying to create a certain build. The crazy thing about life is you're doing the exact same thing, but with your body and your mind using epigenetic modifications. That's how you rewrite your story. Psychologically, yes. Equally importantly, yes. But even the stories encoded in your DNA.
Okay, so now here's the idea. So let's assume that scales as you take on heavier and heavier loads. That more and more of you get more and more informed because you're doing more and more difficult things, but more and more of you gets unlocked. And so then what that would imply is that if you got to the point where you could look at the darkest things, so that would be the abyss, right? That would be the deepest abyss. If you could look at the harshest things, like the most brutal parts of the suffering of the world and the malevolence of people and society, if you could look at that straight and directly, that would turn you on maximally. And so that's the idea of rescuing your father, because imagine that you're like the potential composite of all the ancestral wisdom that's locked inside of you biologically. But that's not going to come out at all unless you stress yourself, unless you challenge yourself. And the bigger the challenge you take on, the more that's going to turn on. And so that as you take on a broader and broader range of challenges, and you push yourself harder, then more and more of what you could be turns on, and that's equivalent to transforming yourself into the ancestral father, because you're like what would you call it? You're the consequence of all these living beings that have come before you, and that's all part of your biological potentiality. And then if you can push yourself, then all of that clicks on, and that turns you into who you could be. That's the re-representation of that positive ancestral father. So that's why you rescue your father from the belly of the beast.
So let's say you're a somewhat fat, lazy, and useless human who wakes up one day and decides to change. Whether it's the twinkle in the eyes of the cute girl next door or thoughts of becoming like your pre-diabetic uncle terrorizing you, you pour the Cheetos and Diet Coke into the garbage disposal and head straight to the gym. It's difficult. In fact, it's painful. And not exactly embarrassing, but, well, now it's pretty much embarrassing, but you suck it up and you push your way through it. And then you do it again the next day. And again. And again, until you've established a legit habit. 5 years later, you're a bona fide stud with that beautiful girl next door hanging on your arm, or handsome fella, and that's all she wrote. So what happened in that nearly invisible world of your DNA? Well, the gene we call PGC1 alpha, that is peroxisome proliferator activated receptor gamma coactivator 1 alpha, this gene is like one of the special categories in Fallout. Physical exercise just so happens to increase the expression of PGC1 alpha. It upregulates the gene, which is a massive buff, you could call it, to your overall system. It helps you burn more fat more effectively. It helps you regulate healthy body weight, increase your stamina, endurance, and overall fitness levels. Oh, it also aids in maintaining healthy blood sugar levels. So the type 2 diabetes your uncle did finally get, well, it's not coming your way. And that's how you rewrite your story. Psychologically, yes. Equally importantly, yes, but even the stories encoded in your DNA. Now, this next section from Jordan Peterson has to do with deciding what you want out of life. After this clip, we'll get into the specific lifestyle changes and habits that cause epigenetic modifications, but choosing what you want, this is a crucial step in the process of rewriting your story and modifying your genes.
And then there are other micro domains that are very crucial that you can also consider. It's like, so you could ask yourself, well, if you could have the education you wanted, what would that look like? If you had the job or career track that would motivate you, just hypothetically, what might that look like? Sketch out a bad plan. If you had some friends, do you want some friends? And if so, how many? And if you had friends and the right number, how much time per week would you like to spend with them? And if you had some time outside of work and familial responsibilities, what might you like to do with your time that you would really like to do? And the thing about these questions is that they're real questions. You know, there's this gospel statement that if you knock, the door will open, and that if you ask, you will receive, and if you search, you'll find. If you seek, you'll find. And people who are faithless in some sense think about it as kind of a Hallmark greeting card approach to the world. It's just, well, you just ask for things and they appear. It's like, no, that isn't what any of that means. It means nothing that you want will manifest itself unless you aim for it. And you won't aim for it unless you know what it is. And you won't know what it is unless you ask yourself.
Okay, so I just wanted to briefly interject this here. So he's talking about the formula Jesus gives the disciples for bringing the kingdom of heaven to earth and more. Basically Christ's version of individuation, which applies at every level of reality and is a pattern that repeats with any goal, great and small. Right? That formula being, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks the door will be opened. The one thing I wanted to briefly follow through on here is the final part of that formula, the door. Knock and the door will be opened to you. The door is the ancient symbol representing that which lies between two different realms or states of being. So basically, the barrier you can only get through by taking action. So that last step, to knock, is incredibly important and solidifies his point here.
And then you might say, well, why don't you ask yourself? And the answer is, well, maybe no one ever explained to you that you needed to, which is a crucial issue. And then maybe you don't also trust yourself. You know, because you might think, well, if I let myself know what I wanted, given my bloody track record, I would do everything I could to screw it up. So I'll just keep myself opaque to myself so that I don't fail at something that's truly important.
Okay, quick recap.
Imagine that you're like the potential composite of all the ancestral wisdom that's locked inside of you biologically. But that's not going to come out at all unless you stress yourself, unless you challenge yourself. And the bigger the challenge you take on, the more that's going to turn on. And so that as you take on a broader and broader range of challenges and you push yourself harder, then more and more of what you could be turns on, and that's equivalent to transforming yourself into the ancestral father. You get more and more informed because you're doing more and more difficult things, but more and more of you gets unlocked.
So what lifestyle changes do that? Well, we covered exercise. Both anabolic exercise and aerobic exercise will rewrite those stories mentally and physically. And that includes things like running, lifting, sparring, fighting, rolling if you're the judo BJJ type, swimming, cycling, sports in most cases, and many, many more. The list goes on. But what else? Good nutrition is a big one, right? Good nutrition plays a massive role in epigenetic regulation. Diets high in processed foods, sugary beverages, and unhealthy fats may negatively impact epigenetic regulation, and almost definitely do. And things like intermittent fasting, for example, and limiting the amount of carbs and especially sugars that you get is incredibly beneficial in this process. What else? We've got pain, good pain. Voluntarily forcing your body and mind into painful situations causes beneficial stress. Like when you exercise or spar or force your overly introverted self into social situations. That can cause beneficial epigenetic modifications. Chronic stress, on the other hand, can impact epigenetic processes in a negative way, potentially leading to health issues. So there's good pain and there's bad pain. Get as much of that good pain as you can possibly push yourself into. Next up, we have minimizing exposure to things like tobacco smoke, air pollutants, pesticides, and other toxins. This can help reduce the risk of epigenetic changes associated with diseases like cancer. Sleep is another huge one. Good sleep and maintaining a healthy sleep schedule have both been linked to beneficial epigenetic modifications. Drinking coffee or other caffeinated beverages after roughly noon or so, thanks to an 8-hour half-life, can drastically reduce your sleep quality, by the way. This is something I learned the hard way and figured I'd pass it on to you. Disrupted sleep patterns and chronic sleep deprivation can impact gene expression and epigenetic regulation, potentially increasing the risk of various health conditions. This is a favorite of mine. Caloric restriction and fasting. Restricting caloric intake and practicing intermittent fasting has been linked to epigenetic changes that may have positive effects on aging and longevity, amongst other health benefits. And there are tons of studies on this that, in my mind, pretty much proves the benefits of fasting and intermittent fasting. Avoiding alcohol, that's a big one. Avoiding alcohol and drugs, all these things are no-brainers in many ways, but this is cliche advice for a reason, because it's correct and it gets repeated ad nauseum, but with good reason. Excessive alcohol consumption and substance abuse have been associated with negative epigenetic modifications. And whether or not those studies are accurate, these are obviously things that are detrimental to our health. So, what else do we have? Social support and good relationships. This is another absolute no-brainer, but these are things that sometimes we need to push ourselves to do. I know I do. Desperately sometimes. I have to push myself, being as introverted as I am. I have to really push myself to get, actually spend time with family and friends. Strong social connections and positive relationships have been linked to favorable epigenetic profiles. And last but not least, we have good old Mother Nature. Environmental factors like exposure to natural environments, green spaces, or sunlight, which aids in vitamin D synthesis, have shown associations with positive epigenetic changes and improved health outcomes. So, how do you level up your skill points like Fallout 4 in the flesh? Take that list I gave you and create sustainable habits in each of those areas, doing your best to improve on them little by little, like Patrick Mahomes would say, each and every single day. Let's go through that list one more time, but really fast. Exercise, good nutrition, good pain, smoke, pollutants, pesticides, right? We're avoiding those as much as we can. Good sleep, caloric restriction and fasting, avoiding alcohol and drugs, social support and good relationships, and nature. All right, that's all I have for you today. If you enjoyed this video or learned something good, please leave me a like and a comment and subscribe and hit that bell, and I will see you in the next one. Mouse died on me. You love dying at the worst times, don't you? Oh, bugger.